webinar. So today we have Professor Roy Friedman, who is going to give a talk on understanding the complexity of financial systems of system. And the next webinar is, and this webinar is offered by IEEE CIS. And the next webinar, if you are interested, is going to be expandable fuzzy system on 24th of June. If you are interested, you can register for the webinar. It already posted in the chat box. And some of the material for this talk is already posted at Professor Friedman website. So I already give you the website already. So now please welcome Professor Friedman to give us a talk. So,
okay. I guess thank you so much, Professor Sansani, and welcome everybody. Let's get down to business. So basically, the big question we want to try to address is why are financial systems so problematical? So what we'll do in the talk, I'll give a very brief introduction and look at what I mean by problematical. You read in the headlines, financial glitches, failures, crashes, disasters. Everyone is worried about all kinds of things. Our approach to trying to understand these things is looking at the financial system as a collection of a system of systems. So it's a little bit abstract approach, which will probably be familiar to many of the IEEE people. We'll give some examples of system properties, financial system of system properties that basically have been distilled from different sources, and just to keep to help me remember what they are, I list them as the four properties A, B, C, D, E, F, and RST. So we'll see what these things mean. We'll spend more time probably on A, B, C, D, a little less because of our time constraints, a little less. We'll talk how these properties impact recent events in high frequency trading, credit crisis, market fragmentation, and so forth, and talk a little concluding remarks and maybe some questions for the future. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So basically, everyone has seen pictures like this, recent headlines. Some of them are more, some of these headlines are more, have evoked more nice images, recipes for disaster, the formula that killed Wall Street. That's a headline I think I like the best. Derivatives are weapons of mass financial destruction. I think maybe that's tied also. Oh, here's something closer. Tokyo tackles trading glitch, $41 billion flash crash in Singapore, all kinds of stuff. So basically, what's going on? Basically, these are something's going on, and it affects a lot of people. Other headlines, 10 trading glitches that stop the markets. It's easy to list headlines, and maybe because as the mathematician Pascal observed years ago, that maybe it's easy to predict bad things because bad things happen often. I guess fat tails and so forth. Other headlines are, you could look at it in my book. There's a little picture of it. And let me just make a note that in this presentation, references listed in this presentation, references cited here are listed in a paper called Understanding the Complexity of Financial Systems of Systems. You could Google me and the title, it comes up, or this is the, it's on the SSRN repository. You can take a look at that. Just as an introduction for different kinds of people, an introduction for engineers and technology people, and a quick review for people in finance. So basically, our universe and scope, financial products, the world of financial products. What are these things? We could give these things in the modern sense, modern programming sense, an object and class oriented description. But basically, let's just be very simple. Financial products evolved from physical assets, which is basically things we eat, we wear, and we burn. Gold, silver. In fact, the word from in many languages for money is derived from silver. So there was an evolution essentially from physical assets to virtual assets, which is basically information. Early sources of that, letters of credit, which are not new. Letters of credit is kind of like a credit card of today, but it's ancient. Legal contracts. If you look at paper money, people call those things, it's like a contract, it's legal tender. Basically, the interesting thing from our perspective of the engineering perspective is the technology exploits or uses databases, which database technology really evolved from ancient times using clay tablets 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago in ancient Sumeria, wood tally sticks where people would make marks on a stick. Clay tablets, by the way, are pretty robust. I mean, you could burn them and you could still read them. Wood sticks, if you burn them, they burn. That's evolved to paper, magnetic, laser DVD. And maybe you could say today, people talk a little bit about maybe blockchain is another database. So there's this evolution of technology. Some other examples just to give us a little perspective. In the 1700s, basically Benjamin Franklin, his currency was basically paper. Watermarked, okay, basically denoting stocks, bonds, cash, etc. You still had physical delivery, but paper was more convenient than moving cows and wheat and gold and silver around. So there was a level of abstraction. The big innovation came in the 1860s, 1870s, actually, with the advance from Morse. But in particular, the printing telegraph patented by Pope and Edison, you can look up their patent, which basically allowed for virtual delivery. So basically in the 1870s, we were wiring money around, cables, and not only money, but treasury bonds, all kinds of financial securities would be wired. So we had this virtual delivery. By the way, for the IEEE people, Edison was one of the founders of the IEEE, Thomas Edison, and Franklin Pope was actually the not the first but the second president of the organization that became the IEEE, the A, I think it was the AEEE or something like that. So for historical reasons, the printing telegraph, which also was sometimes called the ticker, was very much interested to the electrical engineers of the day. Other financial products, we could be abstract. We could talk about contracts of contracts. I mean, if you have a contract, you're going to have a contract of a contract, which leads to things called options, futures, swaps. Sometimes people call these things derivatives, so derivative contracts, collections of these things, portfolios. One other thing, cash settled contracts, where you actually can bet on a number. So you could actually have a financial product looking at average prices of things. You bet on an average and bet on a snowfall or a temperature or price of electricity. You're betting on a number. You don't really need to get delivery. Whether that is fine, sounds like gambling, And some people say it's gambling, and well, we'll talk about it a little bit later. Okay, so basically, let's come back to their problem with financial systems. The common allegory, it seems to be getting a lot of popular. I was reading a book about the blockchains. They had this similar kind of elephant picture too. But basically, financial systems look different to different people. A trader looks at the system, he thinks one thing. An economist, they think game theory. We have lawyers, compliance officers, electrical engineers look at certain things. So one of the problems with financial systems is that there's a lot of components to it. And essentially, sort of the allegory of the blind man or the elephant, you know, you see an elephant, one guy sees a tree and one guy sees something else and so forth. So that's one of the problems. And in particular, well, let's with all respect to elephants, we like elephants, and but let's replace the elephant by something a little bit more abstract from the engineering perspective. A typical financial corporation would look something like this. You'd have someone called a customer, an object called a customer. You'd have some kind of network or some kind of communication mechanism, and there would be different subgroups or subsystems or different components in a financial corporation. So a customer would interact with someone from sales and management. And who is a customer, by the way? Someone who wants to buy and someone who wants to sell, someone who wants to invest, someone who wants to make a bet, speculate. So this organization could have different aspects here. I listed some of these things. Again, to cover everyone would take much more time than we have. But basically, you could see there's some things we'll talk about. Clearing and settlement. Well, that's actually related to whether the customer gets delivery of what he's buying or gets paid for what he's selling. So that's kind of important. There's some legal issues, human resources, and so forth. So a lot of this is sort of financial jargon, which is complicated in its own. What makes life even worse is that when you look at the financial systems of systems, so namely, you have a bunch of, or a set of financial organizations as shown in the first diagram, all connected depending on their roles to each other through other kind of networks, different kinds of financial system protocols. Some of you may have heard of a protocol called FIX. My favorite acronyms are OUCH and ITCH. Some other protocols, FedWire, SWIFT. And you could see that these are all, in a sense, systems. And each system, for example, a broker or a bank or a regulator, they are different systems. So for a particular country, we may have a complicated diagram or an attempt of a diagram that looks like this. And it's a lot of it is very difficult to understand. So again, coming back to our original question, what's going on with all these errors and glitches and problems? We have headlines that say, well, it's just so complex that we can't understand it. So here's some other sample headlines. Market complexity to blame for NASDAQ holds. Take the time to understand the complexities of the market. Suspect emerges. Regulation NMS. Some say increasing the complexity of market is due to regulation. Gee, what regulation? Well, remember, financial markets are regulated in each country, right? So if we have a few hundred countries, you have different regulations and treaties and trades and all kinds of things, and maybe this is why we're having all kinds of issues. Market complexity can trigger the next crash. Again, everyone is easily predicting more bad news, so that's easy. Predicting good news, as Pascal observed, is a little harder. So basically, what's our approach? Use system analogies. So this is common in science and other kinds of aspects. One kind of analogy is, let's see what's been done in the past. So in the world of sociology, people started talking about the social system. Basically, you have individuals and somehow they interact. And indeed, you could say that sociology, you could say, is the study of independent groups on how they work together. Indeed, there's a growing discipline you could look up called the sociology of algorithms. So basically applying sociological concerns and definitions to trying to understand financial markets. It's kind of interesting. Biology, we have this word ecosystem, which I see more than system of system these days. This word ecosystem dates from the 30s, basically showing, I think the standard definition is a network of interactions between a community and environment. This has been adapted the business ecosystem, and what is probably most familiar to the our engineers in the audience, the IEEE, is this phrase "systems of systems," and that's my preferred term, basically because of my background too. Originally in the from the more of the technology and engineering world, it's a little more specific. It's a system of systems is a system whose components are other systems. So let's see, legacy of this, where these things start. Probably the first ones for technology, the Western Union Telegraph Network. People called it the network of networks. Basically, you had a different telegraph companies formulating their different kinds of joining together, sociology, military, other examples, health and human services. So people are looking at these things as well. So let's look at what we're going to concentrate on. Basically, a nice paper in 2008 looked at 40 properties of systems in the literature, and they distilled it to 5. And I basically kind of added 1 or modified them. And my properties are the following of systems: autonomy, belonging, connectivity, diversity, evolutionary feedback, and relationality, sustainability, testability. Those are sort of 3 extra ones. But the basic ones are the ABCDs. So, okay. And also note, the properties are not really mutually exclusive. There's still overlap. So these, we'll talk about that a little bit soon too. Okay, so what do I mean by autonomy? Basically, you have separate components. Agents are independent of each other. Autonomy refers to standalone systems, models, organizations, typically separately designed, built, tested, owned, maintained. Separate organizations is an example of autonomy. Let's see how this looks in the world of financial systems of systems. Let's take a look at the US stock market. So basically, if we look at an investor as an autonomous system, basically a person, typically according to reasonable figures, and these are the sources of the figures down there, Typically in the US, there's on the order of 100,000 million investors. These people are assisted by, a few 100,000 registered individuals, basically, people called brokers. They also seem to be autonomous and intermediaries. The brokers are also organized into firms, so there's about 7,000 of them, and so forth. So the big question is, are these participants autonomous? Are they independent actors? What about other countries and so forth? And again, you could say there's thousands of market intermediaries. A lot of them make their living by charging certain fees. Again, in one sense, one type of brokers you could say are matchmakers. They basically match buyers to sellers. And other types of brokers basically are sort of insurance dealers. Well, maybe not dealers is the right way, but they sort of offer a kind of insurance, a guarantee of payment and delivery. Now, note, not all markets have that guarantee, but it's nice to have, and that's why, for example, trading stocks and exchange-traded products are much less risky. The magic behind clearing and settlement, or payment and delivery, is accomplished through organizations called clearing members, clearing corporations, which are part of a clearinghouse, which has the nice property of realizing the guarantee of payment and delivery, I think 99.999% of the time. It's very interesting. Okay, so let's move on. Just to give you a list of the complexity in the from markets that match buyers to sellers. In the U.S., just looking at the matchmakers listed as exchanges, okay, markets, there's about 27 different competing exchanges. This has actually grown tremendously, especially from the year 2005. And it gets even more complicated. Are these the only US markets? Well, at least in 2014, there's another 80 of them, so-called, we give the name of a trading venue. So these are alternative trading systems, so to speak. So it's very complicated. And when you ask the question, how much does something cost? Well, it's kind of could be ambiguous. Anyway, we're focusing here on autonomy, just to give you the idea of autonomous players and the feeling of different roles that these players can play. Note that these financial systems or financial participants can play different roles at the same time. So this gives us a question: is what do you mean by does autonomy necessarily imply independence or some sort of other kind of dependence, otherwise called conflicts of interest? For example, customers can be traders, traders can be brokers, brokers can be clearing corporations can be traders, brokers own the exchanges. There's all kinds of interesting interactions. This leads us to the second concept of system of systems, namely one of belonging, which basically measures the ability of autonomous actors to basically to become a collective, okay? And there could be different kinds of collectives and organizations as well. We'll quickly look at a couple of them. Here's an example that's come in the press recently. So basically, we have large institutions with lots of money, and they say, well, I'm going to decide to sell 1 million shares of some kind of company. And normally, the way things worked in the past is a lot of if large institutions would stake a position, the smaller traders, people with smaller stakes, would say, "Oh, okay, you know, fine." What's been happening is that what happens if these little players sort of become a coalition in a sense? So basically, that's sort of what happens in this GameStop situation, if people are familiar with that. Namely, somehow using information technology, in the smaller actors sort of could overpower the bigger actor as far as buying and selling. So the big guy wants to sell and the little guys want to buy. When they're unified, they in a power of coalition, they could do that. Of course, the dark side is class action lawsuits. The dark side of belonging is something called collusion, which, since we have laws and regulations, it takes time, but sometimes when these evidence is uncovered in court for collusion and improper execution and violations, there are settlements and monetary penalties and so forth. One interesting hypothesis today, I guess people are looking, is, and it's the people keep studying this, is the question: is there collusion among high frequency traders? Okay, next, connectivity. Basically is concerned with messages, physics of messages, and connectivity, basically a definition, ability to communicate with component systems. In the financial world, we're really dealing with financial messages, typically called orders and quotes. High frequency trading is basically sending orders and quotes really, really fast. According to our technology, note, high frequency or rapid trading is relative to technology. Basically, and an order, by the way, is basically a command to buy something or sell something, basically divided into limit orders, market orders. Market order, buy something, buy this amount now. A limit order, buy something at such and such a price, subject to some condition, and so forth. So a quote is basically looks like an order, but it's a quote is a what a market maker or dealer would say: I will buy this amount from you, or I would sell that amount to you. So let's see what else. Order types evolved from the 17th century. Today, people talk about smart contracts, but it has a very long legacy. There's dozens of different order types now, which impacts our discussion of diversity. That's the D. This is connectivity is the C. And some orders seem to be really complicated to understand. Okay, so this is an issue of connectivity. So again, just to compare connectivity and high frequency trading, just to show how that evolved, basically all we're really doing is buy at one place before the price goes up and sell at another place before the price goes down. Standard way of trying to use technology of making money. The fancy term here is latency arbitrage. So this was done in the 1600s. The technology was the telescope, essentially a signal amplifier that was used to determine whether ships came in, or once you see a ship coming in bearing goods, you know that the money is coming. And whoever knows the information first, right? Whoever has the news first basically would win. Here's another example. Using more technology in the 1800s, let's replace the horse by a telegraph, an optical telegraph. There's an example of a chap telegraph. Here's a little animation. So basically, Signals moving at the speed of light would be used to transmit information, as you can see. These movements on the device here, as you can see, would indicate certain letters in an alphabet, certain commands, certain financial messages. So this was done between New York and Philadelphia, in the 1800s, and exploiting the technology as you could see. Okay, let's see what else. In 1865, a guy named Gin Fisk basically set up his own telegraph line to Nova Scotia to compete with the news ships to Europe. He built the ship, and basically the ship was as fast as essentially as the news ships. By the way, in the 1865, there was not yet a functional transatlantic cable that was fixed after the Civil War. But basically, all he needed to do was get to England just a few hours, and it looks like his ship arrived in England in 6.5 days, and the regular news ships arrived in 7 days. And he basically he had the news that the South lost the war between the states, the Civil War, and made a lot of money with the news. He sold Confederate bonds short, and before the news that the South lost. Today, of course, with undersea cables, the same message would take 29 milliseconds is the fastest one, as you could see. This race, by the way, the technology arms race in connectivity doesn't stop. Basically, again, people are trying to achieve the ultimate limit. So, for example, the ultimate limit between the New York markets and the Chicago markets, and it's really not New York and Chicago. The markets are actually located in the suburbs. In New York, the case is a place called Mahwah, and in Chicago, a place called Aurora. Basically, the ultimate speed limit is set by the phase velocity, the speed of light, the signal speed for light communication, which is about 3.93 seconds. And so far, the one link claims to have a 3.99, so that's pretty fast. Which means that, the guys who built the network in 2010, basically, they really shouldn't use it for high-frequency trading anymore. Okay, anyway, let's see what else. So here's the ABCD. This is the D. Diversity. Ask the question, does everyone have the same information? Exploiting diversity, by the way, leads to arbitrage, because if people have different information, there's certain inefficiencies. And one interesting example with diversity is the downside of diversity, which is what if there is no diversity? What if everyone uses, as an example, the same computational models? So if everyone has the same model, you might have some interesting crowd or herding behavior. The example I have is basically related to the so-called credit crisis. So basically, let's just give a very a simple example of, I'm sure in the IEEE audience, you probably saw this in a connection with fuzzy logic or probabilistic logic and so forth. So here's a simple rule. So suppose if the bond has good credit and there's no news about the bond defaulting, then buy the bond, and we'll give that a confidence of 0.85. You observe, say, a particular company has good credit and there's no news of default. And by the way, these are rules with confidence. Then you then you buy. But the question is, what you have a command or you have a result to buy. What do you buy with confidence? So basically, we're using standard logic connected with some kind of uncertainty. So this is common in fuzzy logic, which is several years old. As an example, in the AI world, we used to call these things uncertainty calculus. So here's some examples. I mean, example one, probability of X and Y is the minimum of the component probabilities, and the probability of X or Y is the maximum of the component probabilities. That's essentially the fuzzy logic used by Professor Zadeh. You could generalize these things. There's some other formulas there. The statisticians call these things, call this group of uncertainty calculus that are consistent with probabilities, they call them associative copulas. And you could actually generalize the formulas to interpolate to some complicated looking function, as Frank demonstrated back in '79. Okay, so what did the finance people do? Finance people really like Gaussian distributions. So the big question is, let's take a Gaussian distribution and turn that into a copula. And if we do that, you have the formula, so the second line here. Probability of X and Y, depending on a parameter rho, is equal to some complicated expression of the component probabilities. So the good news with that expression is that it's a Gaussian distribution. The bad news is it's sort of it's not associative, it's not consistent with logic. This was blamed as the formula that killed Wall Street. And however, it maybe not was the formula, but the sociologist McKenzie, when examining it, interviewed a lot of people and said, gee, here's an example. A senior figure at a bank was asked what correlation model the firm employed. And he said, no, we didn't use any model. So in a sense, maybe it was the firms that used the same model and they surrendered their autonomy and diversity. So let's just quickly review some others. The E and the F, and then we'll stop for some questions. So another aspect of systems, especially financial systems, is somehow how things evolve. So for example, there's a picture of New York City in 1902, and that's the New York Stock Exchange, sorry. And there's the New York Stock Exchange today. Basically, it's a crowd, but you can't see the crowd. It's a crowd of computers versus a crowd of people. But basically, the computers are sort of doing the same thing, except they don't take coffee breaks or eat lunch. Okay, so basically, evolution and feedback is concerned with properties that can emerge that may be unforeseen by designers. You could model these things or attempt to, the reaction to fusion, differential equations, agent-based models we see, and so forth. Basically, you have to keep in mind also the flip side is the law of unintended consequences. And some other things here is, it's basically, you could say there are certain adaptations that systems do from changes in technology, in changes in the nature of the customers, changes in regulation. We'll give a quick example there. Evolution also is characterized by something called punctuated equilibrium. In other words, things are the same, and then all of a sudden there's a change. Sometimes, by the way, systems basically kind of hibernate for a while. They stop, but then they come back to life. Or sometimes they get extinct. Extinction in the financial world is defaults, bankruptcy, and so forth. Oops. Okay, so there's some examples with derivative markets. So, for example, in the 1600s, contracts at the Amsterdam Stock Exchange could be cash settled. You could bet on a number. It was very flexible. In the late 1800s, at least in the U.S., there were lawsuits about that, and essentially, in 1915, the Supreme Court ruled that cash settled contracts actually are gambling. We fast forward, and basically the ruling was reversed, and now they're okay. So things kind of change based on the particular regulatory environment. Also, another point here is regulation. For certain reasons, the government wanted to eliminate essentially the monopoly of the New York Stock Exchange in trading stocks. You can see in this graph that New York Stock Exchange essentially had 80% of the market in trading. After regulation NMS in 2005, something happened, and that actually indirectly led to the growth and the fragmentation of all those different exchanges and alternate trading systems that we see today, especially since these things have to communicate with high frequency trading. Oops. Other things here, this may also impact the flash crashes. And let's see, here's a little picture of something else that could happen, and essentially herd behavior. All right, so we have another elephant here too, the elephant in the room. So our flash crash, as you can see on the left, is an illustration of crowd behavior, as there, shown in the little cute little video. Quick review before we stop for some questions. Attributes of relational, sustainable, and testable. By relational, it's really a question that we don't really have functions. We have another mathematical concept called a relation. In other words, as an example, normally you would think that the price it could be a function of time, but it's not necessarily so. It's kind of could lead to a generalized twin paradox. Sustainable is sort of related to the really endurance. Endurance is really a better label, but to remember I needed RST, so I picked the word sustainable here. And testable, basically, can you test these things? And we'll talk a quick review of that. Basically, relational properties. Essentially, latency arbitrage. Even people knew in the 1600s, there are really several prices at a single time. Some of these days have been changed in the practice of co-location, when essentially when we have a decentralized price, we have price as a function, not a function, but it's a relation. Some observations here, as an example, today's liquid markets, based on regulation NMS and the consolidated tape, are Einsteinian, not Newtonian. So that's kind of a interesting concept of physics applied to markets. As an example, here is a picture of the S1, S2, S3, S4 are essentially market participants reporting their prices to a centralized securities information processor. And the securities information processors collects the prices and rebroadcast them back as the official prices. But there's a delay, you have inconsistencies. What high frequency traders do is everything would be more interconnected to see the latency arbitrage. Sustainability, why are financial systems resilient despite bans, closures, crisis? It's very interesting. So for example, the St. Petersburg Stock Exchange, it was open for, I guess, 1865, 1914. There was a revolution. It opened again 74 years later. New York Stock Exchange didn't really have that kind of history, but they were closed for 3 months, by the way, before World War I. So it's a kind of a hibernation examples. And let me just finally quickly talk about testability. We know that testing discovers faults and failures, etc., problems. The question of testability are, remember, all these systems that we saw in the headlines in the beginning that I indicated in the beginning of the talk, all those systems were tested. No one deploys a system that's not tested. We have armies of programmers and engineers testing, but the question is, are the tests meaningful? There's been some work on looking at defining what testability actually means, and the issue is that a test is meaningful if there's really no dependencies in some kind of hidden states. I mean, some people are observing this from different backgrounds. I mean, sometimes people get angry. Here's a quote: "It's common in the world of finance to use blatantly irrelevant models that can be brute force calibrated, but it spits out things that are meaningless." So what does it mean that things are testable? Note also that the US SEC has issued a systems compliance and integrity regulation, which really wants these systems to be tested. Okay, so let me quickly summarize and offer some concluding remarks and future work. So essentially, we briefly discussed the concepts of financial systems of systems, A, B, C, D, for the most part, a little bit of EF and RST. Basically, we have seen how these properties are depictive, right? They're depictive, but are they predictive? And that's a question which we'll leave to the audience for future work. So our hypothesis are these system of systems property changes, right? Change in autonomy, change in diversity. Are they predictive of some observable event? Note, set up an experiment where we have certain data. There's plenty of glitches reported where there's something that did something. The trick is that these experiments require testable definitions. And also note, a change may have some hysteresis or delay built in. So for example, in 2005 with regulation NMS, it did change the dynamics of the market, which we saw maybe a year or so later. So again, we could depict it after the fact, but are these things predictive? An informal homework would be, hey, when you see the next financial headline, think to yourself, what financial system of system property has changed? And hey, what property has been exploited? Oh, spelling error, by a particular actor. Okay, that's my conclusion. I think we have some time for questions. Note that there's some citations here, attributions for some of the graphics and video, and copyright information. Note that the citations in the paper are referenced in that systems of systems paper. Okay, I guess I could turn it over to Professor Sansini.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Freeman. So if there are any question, okay, I see some question. Okay, hold on. Okay, the first question is that how do you see upcoming technologies such as blockchain changing the list framework in financial institute? Any directional view? That's the first question.
Okay, so the question is concerning blockchain.
Yes.
Okay, so blockchain is an interesting technology. So number one, we can view that as a essentially going from a clay to paper to a different kind of recording media, which has its own interesting rules. The technology is supposed to be disruptive, right? Everyone says it's disruptive. And the big question with blockchain is that does blockchain actually eliminate intermediaries? That's one of the big claims. Decentralization. It's an interesting question, and we're seeing how these things evolve. Everyone has different blockchains. Note, by the way, we could start looking at the ABC RST attributes of blockchain, namely when we look at autonomy. Remember, because we have a consensus model, the question is, the big issue is, are the nodes in the blockchain that evaluate consensus, are they truly independent or autonomous? Note, some of the questions are with that are the so-called 51% attack, which basically shows you that there could be some issues with autonomy. There might be coalitions inside. So a lot of these things have some kind of questions with them, but maybe looking at blockchain in connection with the ABCDEF properties can provide us some insight. Does that help?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And
Okay.
next question is that what change or property you envision in financial system and system with enterprise pushing towards transition finance?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Transition finance?
Yeah, that's what he asked.
Okay, could you read the question again?
Okay, the question is that what change or property you envision in financial system of system with enterprise pushing toward transition finance? That's what he said. Yeah.
Okay, I'm not sure what transition. Maybe you could the questioner could ask transition finance. I'm not sure I understand what that is.
Yeah, I think he might ask what will happen for the finance system, I guess, or economic system.
Okay, I guess when things could change, or maybe related. Maybe please rephrase the question. I know it's difficult with the chat room and everything. But possibly, could you rephrase the question?
Yeah, I'll ask him to ask the question again then. Then we can go to another question. Another question is that can we use concepts from control system to model and predict? I guess this question is that can we predict? Yeah.
Yes. So again, a lot of these concepts that we see actually come from control systems. The big question is that's the golden question is modeling and prediction. Note that most of these financial models, or maybe not most, but many of them use concepts from control systems. The problem is you're dealing with a multi-agent game, whereas you're in control, you're typically dealing with nature, or you're dealing with a one adversary, as in an example of electronic warfare kind of systems. You're either dealing with nature or some kind of adversary. Here, since you have a multi-agent system, things are somewhat more complicated, and the complication yields in the aspect of testability that are it's very difficult to test a hypothesis in these multi-agent kind of systems.
Okay, thank you. Next question is that have you been collaborating with Stephen Institute and their financial engineering group? They are working on modeling the complexity of this exchange to predict future crash.
If Stevens Institute of Technology, I know where they are. I'm looking at them right now. They're across the river from where I'm sitting. I've not been in contact with them. Note that many people are looking at complexity properties from a physics perspective. The people at the Santa Fe Institute, as an example, are looking purely at complexity, but related to physical systems. The complexity we are addressing here is related to a higher level, namely the system, from a systems perspective, system of systems properties, as first described by basically, where's that fellow? Myers' paper in 1997, and also discussed by the distilled by Gorod and other people, at least in those days. So the physicists also look at complexity as well as a symmetry breaking, which is more related to assuming you actually have a model. Here we don't even think we have a model. So again, looking at the elephant analogy, we're trying to understand what's going on from a systems perspective, not necessarily from a pure modeling perspective. Does that help?
Yeah. And do you know how successful it will be using that? Yes.
Oh, how successful? Again,
Yeah.
that's a statistical hypothesis that you
Okay.
could. That's a test. That's we can determine. That's for all our graduate students to try to do a statistical test and actually determine if how predictive these things are. That's a question.
Yeah. Right.
That's my home. That's the homework. That was the homework in the last slide.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So that's the take home.
Okay. And our next question is that, can you give an example of different data set that is suited with each property that we could look into?
Okay. The question is there a data set?
Yeah, I think
that's if we have the data set with each listing each properties, we can try to extract some kind of testable definition. Again, that's the graduate student homework question. Again, what I've done in this talk and also in the paper was propose this way of looking at financial the financial world in a depictive. Again, if you look up the word depictive, it's creating a picture. Okay, so it's really a depictive model, and use the depictive model as a description. Again, the big question is, would these properties itself be predictive? This is our. Let's continue the research.
Yeah. Okay. And that the question that we haven't figured out, I know what he asked now. He asked if what change or property you envision in financial system with enterprise pushing toward climate change.
Oh, that's climate change.
Yeah.
What system of systems property? Well, again, the focus here is not climate change, but on financial systems. We can say, let's come back. I would say that climate change is a function of evolution, okay, and feedback from an environment, right? Like we could say that, right?
Yeah.
Even though we've been looking at changes in technology, customers, and regulation, I would say now the biggest change would be changes in legal and political. I would now put climate change in the legal and political world. And so that would induce some regulatory feedback there. I mean, again, that seems to me, that seems to be the most immediate impact of climate change on financial systems of systems. Again, there are properties. Again, the whole point is that one of the crazy properties, if you like using the word crazy, is there are properties unforeseen by designers. In other words, we make something and it turns into something else. So, so just because you have a nice model, it could do something. It could predict something else, and instead of being good, it could be bad, or instead of being bad, it could be good.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yeah, I think so. And people asking about the PowerPoint. Do you think you can share it? Not your slide.
Oh, okay. I'll see. I could put something together.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. And the record of the video will be posted after the talk. After the system is processed and it's gonna post. So if any one of you want to look at it again, you can see the record of the presentation later. Okay, I think that's it for all the question. I don't have any question in the question box now. So thank you very much, Professor Freeman. We get all the idea now what is financial system and of system. So it's pretty a pretty good talk and pretty good knowledge. Thank you so much.
Okay, you're very welcome, and thank you everyone for your patience, and be healthy.
Yes, be healthy. Okay, thank you. Goodbye.
Okay, bye.